Hi guys, so I'm going to be talking about steps to solving equations with two absolute values. So the first step that we're going to cover is step number 1, which is isolating the absolute value. So over here, this is our absolute value that we want to isolate. And I see here that there is a number on the outside of our absolute value. So I want to do everything in my power to make sure that it goes to the other side. In this case, I see that A is multiplying with B, or absolute value of bx plus c. And if you can't see it, it's always imaginary, especially if it's right next to the absolute value. We say that there is an imaginary multiplication sign. And because it would be multiplying, that means that I would want to divide A on both sides of my equation. And so that would give me my isolation where absolute value of bx plus c is by itself, and we're left with 1 divided by A times the absolute value of x plus d. Or you can also say absolute value of x plus d divided by A. Now the next one says to write two equations. So over here, let's say that I already isolated my absolute value, which is shown over here that it has been isolated. The next step that I would want to do is to create the two equations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be changing my absolute value signs to parentheses. So I'm going to create those parentheses and write in the inside bx plus c equals 2. And the same thing goes for the other side for my first equation, where I'm going to change those absolute value signs to parentheses. And in the inside, it's just going to be exactly the same. So I'm going to write down x plus d. Now in my second equation, that one's going to be a little different. So for the second equation, I'm going to do the same for this part at least. And so I'm going to write down parenthesis bx plus c. And that equals 2. And so this is the part where it gets a little different. We are always going to put a -1 and multiply that with our absolute value, or the other side, whatever is on the other side. So on this side, the absolute value changes to parentheses, and I'm going to write down x plus d and close my parentheses. Those would be my two equations. Now once I finish creating my two equations, the next step is to solve for x. And so after I solve for x, the last step is to check your answer. Now this is really important. You do not want to miss this step because of the fact that you may get two answers, but one of them may not be true. And so I'll give you an example down below of an example of an answer where you do receive two answers, but one of them is not a true statement. So let's try it out first. Over here we have an equation and we have two absolute values. So my first step is to isolate the absolute value. In this case, there isn't anything to isolate on the sides of the absolute value, especially because it only has the absolute value. So in that case, we can already go to step number 2. Now step number 2 is to create our two equations. So I'm going to create my two equations here. My two equations will be parentheses x plus 5, closing those parentheses, and that equals to whatever is on this side, and I'm just changing the absolute values to parentheses. So it turns into parenthesis x plus 11, and I close those parentheses. Now in my second equation, this one's going to be the different one, where I start off with parenthesis x plus 5, and that equals to -1 times whatever is inside my absolute value. So over here, it changes to the parentheses, and then we get the inside, which is x plus 11, and we close those parentheses. So now that we completed step 2, step 3 is to solve for x. So I'm going to start off with this one first, it's just easier. Right here I have x plus 5 equals 2, x plus 11. Now what I want to do is I want to combine the like terms. So I'm going to start off with x. I'm going to subtract x on both sides. When I subtract x on both sides, I get 0 plus 5 equals 2, 0 plus 11. 0 plus 5 just equals to 5, and that just equals to 11. Now, in the case where it says that 5 is equal to 11, that statement is incorrect. Therefore, what I should get is a no solution answer. Okay. So that would be for that equation. Now let's look at the next one. We have this equation still, but we still need to answer. So I'm going to bring down the x plus 5, and that equals 2. And so over here, we need to distribute the negative 1 to our x, and we also need to distribute our negative 1 to the 11. So negative 1 times x, that just equals to negative x. Negative 1 times 11 equals to negative 11. Now we can solve for the x by combining the like terms. So I'm going to combine my x's first. So I'm going to subtract x on both sides. When I subtract x on both sides, I get 0 plus 5, negative x minus x, that equals to negative 2x. And I'm going to drop down the negative 11. The next step that I want to do is combine my 5 and 11. So I'm going to add 11 to both sides. When I do that, I get 5 plus 11 gives me 16, and that equals to negative 2x. And so the last step right here is I see that negative 2 is multiplying with x. And what I want to do now is do the opposite operation, which is dividing negative 2 to both sides. 16 divided by 2, or negative 2, gives me negative 8. And that equals to negative 2 divided by negative 2. Those two cancel out with each other. And so all I'm left with is x equaling to negative 8. So now what I want to do is the last step, which I said was to check our answer. So I'm going to check my answer. So I have my equation here, which was the absolute value of x plus 5, and I close those absolute values. And I have absolute value of x plus 11. What I want to do is substitute my negative 8 for x. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create parentheses because I want to make sure that whenever I'm substituting a number, I switch it out with parentheses and the number. And then I have negative 8 plus 5, and that equals to parenthesis negative 8 plus 11. So negative 8 plus 5, that gives me negative 3. And I keep those parentheses or absolute values because I only solved what's in the inside so far, nothing on the outside yet. So that's why I want to keep those absolute values. And then on the other side, I have the absolute value of, so negative 8 plus 11, that gives me positive 3. And so right here, I have the absolute value of negative 3, that equals to positive 3. Absolute value of positive 3 also gives me positive 3. So in the end, I know that this is correct. Therefore, my answer is x equals to negative 8. Alright, let's try out example 2. So example 2, we have the absolute value of 2x plus 12 equals to 4x. And what I want to do is I want to see if there's anything that I need to isolate. If there's anything on the outside here, on the outside of the absolute values. I see none, so I'm going to move to the second step, which is to create my two equations. So my first equation, just like before, I'm going to change my absolute values to parentheses, and I get 2x plus 12, and that equals to positive 4x. On the other side, I get the parenthesis 2x plus 12, and then that's where it gets a little different, where we multiply our 4x by negative 1. And so the last step is to solve for x. So I'm going to start off with my left equation first. I see here that we have 2x plus 12 equals to 4x. The only like terms that I do see are 2x and 4x. So I'm going to combine those together first. I'm going to subtract 2x on both sides. When I subtract 2x on both sides, I get 0 plus 12 equals to positive 2x. And then the last thing is to divide 2 on both sides. When I divide 2 on both sides, I get 6 is equal to x. Next one is over here on this side. So I'm going to first distribute my negative 1 to our 4x. And when I do that, I get 2x plus 12 equals to negative 4x. So I still see that the only like terms are 2x and negative 4x. I'm going to combine them together by subtracting 2x on both sides. When I subtract 2x on both sides, I get 0 plus 12 equals to negative 6x. And then the last step is to just divide negative 6 on both sides. 12 divided by negative 6 gives me negative 2 equaling to positive x. Now the last step again is to check our answer, which is really important. So over here I'm going to have our equation, which is absolute value of 2x plus 12 equals to positive 4x. And I want to substitute my x for the 6. So I'm going to get the absolute values, and then I'm going to put parentheses in place, and then add my number in there. Then drop down the 12, absolute value, and then in the 4, I'm going to substitute the x for the parentheses 6. And then I solve anything that is inside my absolute value first. So 2 times 6, that gives me 12 plus 12 with the absolute values, and 4 times 6 gives me 24 as well. So I'm left with 24 absolute value equaling to 24. Absolute value 24 just gives me 24. And so my statement is true. That means that x equaling to 6 is a true statement. Let's try checking out x equals to negative 2 and see if that one works. So over here, I'm going to substitute my absolute value, substitute the x for negative 2 instead. Then I'm going to add it with 12, close that absolute value, and then substitute again for negative 2. Next step is to solve everything inside my absolute value. So I see here that 2 times negative 2, that gives me negative 4, plus 12, and I close those absolute values, and then 4 times negative 2 gives me negative 8. Then over here, I see that negative 4 plus 12, and that equals to positive 8, with the absolute value still. I drop down my negative 8. Absolute value of positive 8 just gives me positive 8. And so I'm left with positive 8 equaling to negative 8. Now that statement is not true. And you can also see that on the number line. So for example, let's say that 0 is here. This is 1, or let's go by 2's. So 2, 4, 6, 8. And on the other side is -2, -4, -6, and -8. If it was the case where they were equal to each other, then they would, if like, let's say that we start off with 8, so 8 would be here. Then if it was equal to each other, then this number should line up directly on 8. But that's not the case. We see that -8 lines up directly on the opposite end. Therefore, 8 does not equal to -8. This statement is not true. And so because of that, we cannot say that x is equal to -2. We would cross that answer out. And so the only answer we would have here is x is equal to 6. Now remember that before all of this in my steps, I said to make sure to check your answer because of this reason. This example proves that you have to check your answer, or else you may not know that one of your answers over here is actually incorrect. Alright, let's go to example 3. So example 3, we do see that there is a number outside of our absolute values. So because of that, we want to move this number to the other side. So I'm going to move it to the other side. And I see that 2 is multiplying with x plus 2 absolute value. And the reason why I wrote that multiplication sign is because I like to just see it there. I know it's imaginary, but it's always good to have imaginary numbers shown. So since it is multiplying, I want to do the opposite operation. And so my opposite operation would be dividing. So I'm going to divide 2 on both sides. When I divide 2 on both sides, I'm left with this being canceled out. And I get absolute value of x plus 2. And I close those absolute values. And then I have 4 divided by 2. 4 divided by 2 equals to 2. And I have an absolute value of x minus 2 still there. Okay, now that my absolute value is completely isolated, I can go to my step 2, which is to create my 2 equations. So I'm going to create my 2 equations here. And when I do that, I get the parenthesis x plus 2 equals to 2, and I just change those absolute values to parentheses. So that'll be my first one. I'm going to move it a little more to the other side so I have more room for my other equation. Now for my other side, I get parenthesis x plus 2. Now this one is a little bit trickier. So because I have a number outside of my absolute value, it's going to look a little different compared to what we usually see. So I get my 2, and I'm going to add brackets because the only thing that I want to multiply my -1 with is my absolute value. So I'm going to cut off the 2 from my absolute value, and that's where I'm going to write down that I want to multiply -1 with parentheses the absolute value, or the parenthesis of x minus 2. Oops. And then afterwards, I'm going to close those brackets. So the idea is that right here, the reason why I did this was because the only thing that I want to multiply -1 with is whatever is inside my absolute value. I do not want to multiply -1 with that 2. That would not work. So let's start solving for x. On this side, I see that there is a distribution. So I'm going to distribute the 2 with the x and the -2. I get x plus 2 equals 2. 2 times x just gives me 2x. And then 2 times -4 gives me 2 times -2 equals to -4. Then the last step is to combine any like terms. So I'm going to combine my x's first by subtracting x on both sides. So when I subtract x on both sides, I get 0 plus 2 equals to positive x minus 4. And then I want to combine the 4 and my 2, so I'm going to add 4 to both sides. When I do that, I'm left with 6 equaling to x. So I have one answer so far. Now let's look at the intense problem over here. So the first thing that I want to do is distribute. I'm going to distribute my negative 1 to my x and then also to my negative 2. When I do that, I'm left with the parentheses of x plus 2 because I dropped that down. I'm also going to drop down my positive 2 because I'm still not solving that yet. And I'm going to use those brackets again because I still haven't done anything to the brackets. I'm only done things to whatever inside my parentheses. And so I'm left with negative 1 times x, that equals to negative x. And negative 1 times negative 2 gives me positive 2. And then I'm going to close my brackets again. The next step is to distribute the 2 with the negative x and positive 2. When I do that, I dropped everything else down, the x plus 2, and I'm left with 2 times negative x, that gives me negative 2x. And then 2 times positive 2, that just gives me positive 4. Okay. Last step is to combine the like terms. I see that x is a like term, so I'm going to subtract x on both sides. And then I get 2 equals to negative 3x. And I'm going to drop down that 4. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is combine the 4 and the 2. So I'm going to subtract 4 on both sides. When I subtract 4 on both sides, I am left with negative 2 equaling to negative 3x. So since negative 3 is multiplying with the x, I'm going to do the opposite, which is divide negative 3 to both sides. And now I am left with negative 2 divided by negative 3, which gives me a positive 2 over 3. And so I'm left with x equaling to 2 over 3. Now am I done? I am not done. The last and final step is to check. It is a lot of work, but to get the correct answer, we always have to check. So let me write down my equation here, which was 2 with the absolute value of x plus 2, closing that absolute value, and that equals to 4, the absolute value of x minus 2, right? Yeah. The first thing I'm going to do is substitute x for 6. So when I do that, I get 2, and then I get parentheses 6 inside, and then I add 2. The next one I have is parentheses 6, and I subtract it with 2, and I close those absolute values. And then the next step is to solve anything that's inside my absolute value. So I see here that 6 plus 2, so that's going to give me 8. And then I drop everything else down. I have my 4. 6 minus 2, that gives me positive 4. So 2, and then that changes into parentheses 8, because absolute value of 8 gives me 8 as my answer. And on the other side, 4, and then we have absolute value of 4, that equals to positive 4. So I change those into parentheses. 2 times 8 gives me 16, and 4 times 4 gives me 16 as well. So because 16 equals to 16, I can say that is true statement, so that means x does equal to 6. Let's look at this one right here. So we have x is equal to 2 divided by 3. We still need to check because just because some questions do get one answer only, that doesn't mean that all answers are going to be just one answer. Some of them might be 2. So I'm going to substitute the 2 over 3 in my equation here. And I'm going to add 2 to it. On the other side, I have 4. And I'm going to substitute the 2 over 3 again and subtract that with 2. So the next step is to solve for whatever is inside here. Now because I have fractions, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. I'm going to start off by dropping down my number, and I'm left with 2 divided by 3 plus, and I want to have the same denominator. So if I want the same denominator, I need to have 3. That means that 2 over 1, if I want to convert it into 3, I could multiply 3 to both sides. So if I multiply 3 to both sides, then I'm left with 6 divided by 3. So I'm going to write down 6 divided by 3 on this side. Over here, I have parentheses 2 divided by 3. And that's going to subtract with 6 divided by 3. So I close those absolute values. Okay. Next step is to combine anything that is inside of the absolute value. So 2 over 3 plus 6 over 3, that gives me 8 over 3 with the absolute value still, because I still haven't solved that. And then I'm left with 4 times 2 divided by 3 minus 6 over 3, that gives me negative 4 over 3. Okay, now I want to solve my absolute value. So when I solve it, I use parentheses instead. So I'm going to make it look more like parentheses. Over here I get 8 over 3, close those parentheses. And on this side, it changes into, instead of negative 4 over 3, I'm going to get positive 4 over 3. Last step is to multiply. So since we're looking at fractions, I'm going to change my whole number into a fraction. That makes it easier for me to see what I am multiplying with each other. And then the same goes for the other side as well. So I get 4 over 1 divided by, or times 4 over 3. So that gives me 2 times 8 is equal to 16. Then I have 1 times 3, that gives me 3. And that equals to 4 times 4, that equals to 16. And the last one is 1 times 3. And 1 times 3 just gives me positive 3. So in the end, this answer works too. Like I said, you might get a case where 2 answers actually work. And this is one of those cases. So those are the 3 different examples that you could face while answering the problems. Hopefully this helps. Good luck.